much, Lucas. So I'm going to introduce John Vanderslice. John Vanderslice teaches creative writing in the program at the University of Central Arkansas. His stories, poems, essays, and one-act plays have appeared in scores of literary journals, including Laurel Review, Seattle Review, South Carolina Review, and Crazyhorse. His historical novel, The Last Days of Oscar Wilde, has just been released by Burlesque Press. Please welcome.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, so this is it's a historical novel. I'll just quickly sketch the arc of Oscar Wilde, in case you're not familiar. Of course, a famous playwright, poet, novelist. And just at the height of his fame and success, he was convicted of gross indecency in London. This is 1895, which meant they were sure, the jury was sure he was gay, but they couldn't prove he committed sodomy. So that was gross indecency. And, so he got 2 years in prison for that. It was a horrible 2 years, as you can imagine. And came out, and then he moved immediately. He left England and went to France and lived in Europe, mostly in Paris, for the last 3 years of his life. So my novel is sort of my, I mean, it's based on research, but it's my imagining dramatically how his life would have looked, how his friends would have been, and what their concerns would have been, and how Wilde would have fought back in some ways against what they were asking of him. I'm going to read a bit of what ended up being the prologue to my book. I was kind of, it's a book of very distinct scenes, and I wrote it that way, and not in any particular order. I didn't know this was a prologue when I wrote it, but it ended up, it seemed like it was a good idea because it kind of represents, the scene itself represents the kind of the totality of his life that he was living at the time that I'm writing about. It's also, it's not in his, from his point of view. Pretty much the rest of the book, Oscar Wilde's point of view character. The point of view character for this is a man named Armstrong, who, based on a real person, he was from Arkansas, and so I didn't choose that as a matter of convenience. I live in Arkansas now. The person is based on actually was named Armstrong, did come from Arkansas, and did meet Wilde in Paris twice, once at a cafe and once while he was painting. Armstrong was an aspiring painter. I changed his bio a bit. He's now a semi-aspiring lawyer in this scene. I'm going to pick it up a few pages in. He is sitting at a cafe. It's the first day where the weather has been half decent since he's been in Paris. He's doing the tour of the airplane to get ready for a life of a gentleman lawyer back home. Armstrong was finally alive and outdoors in the middle of it, Paris city center, only a few minutes walk from the Seine. As soon as he finished its last glass of wine, he would wend that way, cross at the Pont Neuf, which was sure to be crowded now with thriving, shining bodies. Today he would stop at those stalls on the other side of the bridge and inspect all wares for sale. It didn't matter if they were useless, because he didn't need anything at all. Or rather, what he needed was to be outside in the city of light, with the sun turned on. He remembered at once the cigar in his jacket pocket, what he'd intended to smoke as soon as he'd finished his tart. How could he forget? He brought the thing all the way with him from Hot Springs, 1,500 miles across the eastern quadrant of the United States, another 3,000 miles across an ocean, and then 140 miles from Le Havre to central Paris, all for the sake of enjoying it after his first real cafe meal. What months ago he promised himself when he bought the cigar, the most expensive he could find in a tobacconist shop back home. "I'm not going to smoke this," he announced to his father and mother, "until I am sitting outside a cafe, a little street-side table, with a full belly and sunshine above." In his 4 days in Paris, he'd eaten at plenty of cafes, but he kept the cigar stowed in his coat pocket, waiting. Even today he waited, deciding that
With the fine weather, he would take a much longer morning constitutional, hiking all the way from his hotel on the Rue de Lorient up to Montmartre, around the curving streets there, then back down again. He passed by the Café de la Régence shortly after 1, so famished at that point that he could not help but stop and order what, based on his rudimentary French, seemed to be the most substantial repast available, replete with the tart and a bottle of wine. He clipped the cigar and brought it at last to his lips, only to realize that he had no match. Armstrong laughed. He'd lugged the damn thing all the way to Paris, but forgot to bring matches. Sometimes, in odd moments like this one, he wondered if he really was fit for a law career after all. Sometimes his mind seemed altogether too foggy. A man two tables away eyed him with a look that Armstrong could not decide whether to interpret as concern or disapproval. A stony, penetrating stare coming from dark eyes set inside a wide, pasty face. The stranger had lips more prim than normal for a male, and yet the delicacy of those was offset by an overbearing nose and a broad chin. He was wearing a light brown coat that appeared a bit worse for the wear, perhaps one could say fusty, also a black bowler. The hair that stuck out from beneath the bowler seemed mismanaged, as if he were weeks overdue for a trim. Yet the impression the stranger's stare gave off was not so much tawdriness, but a penetrating, possessive intelligence, a discriminating and scrutinizing air. Armstrong wondered if he'd accidentally dribbled a bit of wine on his collar, or dropped crumbs from the tart onto his sleeve, some violation of decorum that revealed him as a novice. Rather than suffer the stranger's scrutiny, Armstrong looked again at the street, tried to fix his attention on some particularly glamorous or ridiculous figure. But there's no one like that at the moment, only ordinary Parisians going about their business. He was wondering whether he should just abandon the last glass of wine when he sensed someone near him. He turned his head and saw that it was a stranger, standing now at his table as stolidly as if Armstrong had summoned him for an errand. "I see," the man started, "that you are unable to light your cigar. May I offer you a match?" Armstrong laughed. So that's what the man's stare was about? He nodded. "I was hoping no one would notice. I don't know how to ask for one. Kind of embarrassing." "No reason to let ordinary embarrassment keep you from enjoying a good cigar." By the way, I'm not doing an English accent, just The stranger reached into his pocket, removed a matchbox, and struck one. He leaned in closer, putting the little flame in Armstrong's service. Armstrong took the initial puff and felt the heady rush of smoke, so long anticipated, into his mouth, over his tongue, into his brain. Indeed, this would be a very good cigar. He leaned back, blew out the mouthful in a rush. He closed his eyes. He opened them. The stranger stood there, regarding him with an envious smile. "Thank you," Armstrong said. "Then, please." He gestured to the open chair on the other side of the table. The stranger nodded, a small, grateful motion, and sat. "I'm sorry to say that this is the only cigar I have. I brought it from home to save for a day just like this one." A subtle gesture, the stranger concurred, and apparently a wise one, given how much pleasure it affords you. Armstrong smiled. He didn't know what to make of this English-speaking stranger, one who had so easily pegged him as another traveler from the Anglophone world. On one hand, the man seemed perfectly harmless, even gracious, and certainly graceful. He spoke with an aristocratic pronunciation and syllabic emphasis, as if he went home each night and performed in front of a mirror. But no, his sonorous speech rolled off him too easily for that. He seemed born to it in a way that British speakers so often do, in a way that Americans, for all their colorful bravado and New World slang, could never hope to equal. This aspect of the stranger was flawlessly polished and not a little intimidating for the 25-year-old Arkansayer. But then again, it was quite at odds with the threadbare coat, the untrimmed hair, the tint of despair accenting the corners of the man's eyes. Was he an underemployed scholar, badly in need of new pupils? Or a gentleman who had suffered some catastrophic financial downturn? Something so awful it turned him out of his comfortable Paris apartment and into the streets? Or was he simply a charming hobo, surviving on his wits in one of the world's busiest cities? Armstrong could not know for sure, but he sensed that the stranger was not trying to sell him anything or take anything from him. Instead, the man just seemed in need of company. Armstrong spoke. "How about I tell the waiter to bring another bottle of wine?" The stranger almost grimaced, but then his expression relaxed. I would be in your debt, and thankful, but that's not why I offered you the light. I know, but it's the least I can do for someone who rescued my plans. Rescue? I've owned that cigar for nearly 5 months. I've been waiting for just the right time to smoke it. It would have represented quite the overthrow to have had to leave here today without enjoying it. A slow nod of recognition from the stranger. The waiter noticed Armstrong's gesture and came over. May I? The stranger said. I think there's a variety you might like even better. Please, Armstrong said, but let me pay. Of course, the stranger said, and proceeded to address the waiter in a French so natural that Armstrong wondered if this was the man's real speech, and the English a magnificent put-on. Even if Armstrong lived a whole year in this city, he could not speak French that well. 2 years, hell, 5. You've been in this country a while, Armstrong said when the waiter left, from the sound of it. I've been a bit of everywhere, actually. Your accent is impeccable. I mean your French accent. The stranger smiled wryly, but the longer the smile remained, the more it turned down at the ends. Like an emotional pointer, his face could not resist. Accents are a simple matter, a bit of rudimentary acting. But it's not just the intonation. You know the language itself so well. The man made a dismissive gesture. Not so well as you think, according to some people. Armstrong was about to ask which people, but the waiter returned with uncharacteristic rapidity, a sign that Armstrong interpreted to mean that the period for déjeuner was fast closing down, and liaisons were expected to be gone sooner rather than later. And yet, here was the bottle. The waiter had not tried to talk them out of it. When one is raised in England or Ireland or Scotland, and if one attends a passable school, learning French is practically an automatic affair. It is right from the start. Well, for me too. I mean, my father paid for private tutors. There was never a question. But I haven't got half your accent or your fluency. The stranger offered a languid, distracted shrug. He'd become bored with the subject or embarrassed by it. Armstrong couldn't tell. For a few moments, the man's face closed down. He looked at the street without quite registering what he saw there. Then he took a sip of wine and started talking. You said that you brought the cigar from home. May I ask where that is? America, Armstrong chirped. Of course, America, the stranger said, as if insulted. Where in America? Armstrong told him, and the stranger looked surprised. Now that may be the only place in your country I have not visited. I don't know, Armstrong said. Doubt that. My country is mighty spacious. Many corners. Meager smile from the stranger, a smile that acted like a lockbox. But then, the stranger gave him the key. Years ago, I traveled for 10 straight months across your country. 10 months? Where did you go? Everywhere. Without exaggeration, everywhere. Except for Arkansas. That's more or less true. Armstrong chuckled but said nothing. Instead, he waved for the stranger to continue. New York, of course, the man said, several times. But really, the full extent of the land, every direction, big cities and small, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco, Denver. As the list went on, he slowed, thinking harder to pull out the names. Fort Wayne, Racine, Cincinnati, where else? Houston, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Richmond, dozens of others, large and small. The South, too, then. As I said, every direction, even a bitty little community in Rhode Island, rarely visited by anyone, I dare say. Which? It's called Pawtucket. Armstrong nodded hardly. I've heard of it. Couldn't tell you what it's about, however. Nor could I. It was just the one night, more than 15 years ago. His voice trailed off wistfully. That's a nice bit of wandering. But how did you cover your expenses? It must have been titanic. What did you do? A startled grimace crossed the stranger's face. Armstrong remembered too late what he'd been told several weeks before he left home. Europeans do not like to talk about money and how they got it. Either they have it or they don't. That is all you need to know. This was hard for Armstrong to understand and even harder to accept because in America, money talked as freely as money itself, flowed as freely as money itself. People were not only willing but eager to explain to you how they made a buck, especially if it was a buck more than the next man. Such talk was part of the fun of being rich. When Armstrong expressed his incredulity about this advice, he was told, chances are it goes back to some quirk in the family tree. Somebody married someone they shouldn't, and whether they made him rich or poor, they don't care to have it discussed. So it must be with this stranger, Armstrong thought. There's a story he can't tell, and yet I'm trying to force it out of him. He was about to apologize when the man answered his question. Well, that's just it. All the traveling was for the sake of earning money. It is how I covered my expenses. What did you do? Perform in a circus? Now the stranger laughed, not guffawing, not with hilarity. There was something broader and sadder and more important behind it. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Every night, 3 rings, a strong man, dancing animals, many bearded ladies, and I myself was the acrobat. Armstrong could tell, of course, that the stranger was talking sarcastically, but at the same time, the man's voice carried no malice. He spoke without bitterness. He was not trying to make fun of Armstrong, even if he was lying to him. But what was he trying to make fun of? At that moment, Armstrong saw another stranger approach his table. This man looked at least 10 years older than himself, with shredded strands of gray in his otherwise dark sideburns, and a look of moral severity in his expression, and urgency in his eyes, as if he just recognized Armstrong as the one who, a few years earlier, had poisoned his dog. Now the man wanted to give Armstrong his due. Armstrong cut off the conversation with the polite stranger at his table and raised himself slightly in his seat to get ready for whatever this new man had to say. It was then he realized he'd seen the man before. When Armstrong had first taken his table, the severe-looking gentleman had been sitting at a table further down the sidewalk, a woman across from him, fingering menus. Armstrong had not tried to catch the man's attention, and Armstrong hadn't spared a glance that way the whole time he devoured his meal. Yet here was the self-same gentleman approaching him with an intentional look. When the man was only a step or two away, all of Armstrong tensed, and his right hand curled into a fist. A bad habit, perhaps, left over from a hot springs childhood, but a habit nonetheless. It turned out the man did not slow and did not stop. He did not, in fact, say a single word. What he did was to flip a small white card onto Armstrong's lap as he passed. Armstrong looked down, confused. What just happened? He saw the card bright against the black of his trousers. He read the words that were written there in the thick gray lead, a hurried, slovenly cursive. This man is Oscar Wilde. Armstrong looked up and into the face of the disheveled stranger, the charming hobo seated at his table. The stranger's face had changed drastically, as if he had been unable, from where he sat, to read the card and precisely interpret its import, as if he knew everything about it. Now that Armstrong considered it, the man at his table did look like an older, oversized version of the famously scorned Esty, whose trial in 1895 had caused such a scandal in the American papers, and who was now known to be shambling through a variety of European cities, disgraced and practically hiding. Wilde looked disconcerted, maybe even abashed. He stared into Armstrong's eyes for seconds, as if hoping to find mercy there, but then he looked away abruptly, as if certain he would not. Armstrong didn't know if Wilde should feel disconcerted. He didn't know how he himself felt. He seemed to feel 3 or 4 things at once: honor and disgust, astonishment and rude, incredulity and a queer kind of joy. The man sitting across from him, the man who had chosen to sit across from him, was only 5 years earlier one of the most lionized, recognizable men in the Western world, the new king of the London stage. Of course, the same man, as if overnight, had become toxic goods, preached about in pulpits, defamed in the press and on college campuses, on the losing end of so many strident public attacks. The last time he was in St. Louis, Armstrong had seen in the window of a bookshop a volume titled The Sins of Oscar Wilde. That's a real book, by the way. He hadn't bought it. Now, here is Wilde himself, sharing his bottle of wine. One thing was sure, the strange moment had gone on too long. Armstrong needed to say something. He needed to set the atmosphere right, but his tongue stayed heavy, unwilling to move. A curtain fell over Wilde's face. He looked at Armstrong directly, dark eyes level and set with resolve. I removed the embarrassment, he said, and stood. With that, he took one step to his left and surged forward, past Armstrong's right shoulder, headed west on the Rue Saint-Honoré, as if he had a mind for the Tuileries. Ironically, the same direction the man with the card had gone. Armstrong was so flustered and guilty and angry, at whom he wasn't exactly sure, that he forgot to ask the waiter for l'addition. Instead, he blindly cast down scores of francs and stood. By the time he gathered himself sufficiently to look over his shoulder, Wilde was a dozen steps up the street, surging on, as if his feet were on fire. Armstrong didn't think about chasing the poet down. Instead, he stepped onto the Rue Saint-Honoré and started off the other way. That's all. Thank you.